to this week's Asia Research Story. I'm Renee Jeffery, and it's my pleasure to be hosting another great Asia Research Story. I'm really pleased that you can all join me today. Really thrilled to be talking today to one of our fantastic and unbelievably energetic PhD students. Before I introduce her, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, watching and participating in today's event. Today I'm on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. As always, I welcome everybody who's joining us live on Zoom. Can I just remind you all not to turn your cameras or microphones on during the presentation, because that just causes some issues with the editing. There will be a short Q&A at the end of the session. Please submit your questions using the chat function, and don't worry about waiting till the end. It's really nice for us to have some ready to go when we get to the Q&A part of the session. We'll be over on Twitter later in the afternoon to continue the conversation, and our hashtag is Researching Asia Stories. For those who are listening to the recording or watching the video after, I hope you enjoy the conversation and that you can join us live at some point in the future. So I'm really excited to introduce this week's guest, Elise Stephenson. Elise is a PhD student at Griffith University, although she just submitted her thesis, so with any luck we won't be saying that for too much longer. Elise has a Bachelor of Asian and International Studies and a Bachelor of Communication from Griffith University. She was awarded first class honours in Government and International Relations and was a university medalist. Elise has an incredibly impressive list of awards and appointments. If I read through them all, we wouldn't have any time for the conversation, so I'm just going to mention one or two of them. Elise has been named in the list of young women to watch in international affairs, the 30 under 30 LGBTI plus role models, and she won a United Nations Australia Association Community Award. She's the co-founder and director of the Social Good Outpost and a member of the board of Brisbane City Council. The list goes on and on and on, but in any case, welcome, Elise.
Thank you so much. It's really brilliant to be here, and I look forward to talking a bit more about what it means to research in Asia.
Great. So, obvious first question. You came to Griffith as an undergraduate to study Asian studies. What inspired your interest in Asia?
Yeah, so I was actually pretty lucky. All throughout my childhood, I grew up, my parents had lived before in Japan. My mum learned to play the Japanese harp, the koto, and my dad learnt architecture over there. And they're actually part of a Griffith University trip to China in the 80s, I believe, with the Vice Chancellor. And so I was fortunate that my whole childhood was surrounded by wonderful people popping by from Asia and kind of sharing of their stories and cultures and experiences. And so when it came to that crunch time to choose, you know, where I go and what I do, I thought, you know, really I'm just going to follow what I'm interested in. And I was really interested in Asia. And I looked around and Griffith was the obvious choice with the Griffith Asia Institute. So it's kind of been something I think that's been building through my whole life, actually. But I really feel at home here in the region and learning about, you know, everything that it has to offer.
So you have, a great story of a childhood full of sort of, interesting sort of insights into Asia. And then you came to Griffith to do your undergraduate degree. And I can see that, during that time, you went on lots and lots of really interesting trips to events in the region. You were a student delegate at summits and conferences. You did a stint as a community development intern in Laos, part of your degree in Hong Kong. I mean, so a huge number of really amazing opportunities. Were there any sort of particular moments in those that were really sort of aha moments that really, changed how you thought about the world or your place in the world or the region, sort of more specifically?
Yeah, I think there were, and I was reflecting on this only earlier, but I think through my undergraduate degree, I was just very fortunate that I kind of came in to study Asia just as the government kind of announced this whole Australia in the Asian century. I think I was one of 2 students in my cohort studying Asian studies, which is unbelievable, and I thought just such a shame. But as a result, I was kind of in the right place at the right time, and so I guess over this period of spending my time in the region, there was probably 2 periods that really kind of shifted the way that I perceived things, or challenged, I guess, the way that I operated in the region. And the first would be, as you mentioned, when I went to Hong Kong on the New Colombo Plan scholarship. I was conducting my honours research there at the time. I was, doing a bit of comparative study between women leaders in Asia and in Australia. And I'd arrived just after the 2014 Hong Kong kind of protests had broken out, the umbrella movement, kind of protesting about democracy and what was Hong Kong's place in the world, which of course are really big topics right now for Hong Kong still and kind of have built upon. But during this period, I think, I was researching people, and the Vice Chancellor of our university was getting death threats over in Hong Kong because he was standing up for gender equality. It was a time where you kind of had to navigate fractious community relationships and really see how was society going to adapt to a lot of the changes that was happening, political, social, economic. And so a few years later, when I was doing my PhD, and in 2018, I'd kind of embarked on this 3-month stint of traveling around the world to conduct my data collection. And I ended up landing back in Hong Kong. And it was just really fortuitous. I was there for a big international human rights festival that I was co-curating with some members from UNDP, Being LGBT in Asia program. And we'd co-curated this week-long intersectional human rights festival. Because I had this background of being in Hong Kong and kind of just seeing how all of these community tensions kind of all came together, we had this really unique opportunity. It was the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had this aim: let's get together 70 different NGOs, community groups, schools, kind of thought leaders, and we brought them all together to discuss issues like, climate change, or, conflict resolution after major wars, or to discuss plastic pollution or gender equality. But the thing that we did, which really pushed me to think more critically about both my research and my engagement more broadly in the region, was that we thought about, okay, well, how would climate change affect a transgendered woman in the Pacific Islands? Or how would conflict resolution affect a deaf intersex person from Pakistan? How would things like migration and refugee movements affect a lesbian Indigenous woman from the Myanmar-Thailand border? We actually even had, as one of our speakers, the first openly gay prince in the world from India, which was Prince Manvendra Singh Gohil. And we just got to talk about all of these issues on so many different levels and really unpack this idea, because, I might be talking about human rights right now, but you can apply it to any sphere of research or your work. And basically this understanding that what is human rights for me isn't the same for others. And I think that couldn't be more timely right now in this moment where, we're having all kinds of race relations happening across the world. And I think that was a really big eye-opener for me of when we're conducting research, when we're out there and engaging with communities, whatever kind of research or engagement we're doing, we have to make sure that we're coming at it from multiple angles to kind of get the most holistic picture and ultimately provide the best solutions, which is really what I've tried to do in my research and kind of career since then.
Yeah. Oh, so that's a great segue to the next sort of thing I wanted to ask you about, to do with your career, because your career has really combined lots of different things. You've got some academic work there, but with diplomacy, consulting, design work, and so on. Somebody might look at what you've done and think, oh, wow, that person's a bit hyperactive. And maybe there's a bit of truth to that. But but maybe there's a bit more to it than just being, you know, intellectually hyperactive and interested in lots of different things. So the title of your Asia story today was Antifragility in Academia. And this, I'm guessing, is a reference to the book Antifragile, Things That Gain from Disorder by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. What's that book about, and how's it influenced how you've gone about sort of making choices about how to construct a career?
Yeah, so I think I was in Hong Kong actually during my research when I first read Antifragile. Definitely worth reading if you're interested in basically how do we grapple with a world full of uncertainty. And for me, what I kind of saw was I was at this point, I was about to finish my honours research, I was about to launch out there into the world. You know, there was a bit of professional and personal uncertainty of where were things going. And in fact, if you look at the research now, you know, kind of this generation is pitched to have at least 5 different careers, over 17 different jobs in their lifespan. There's no way that the jobs and the careers and even the forms of work that we always thought were guaranteed and for sure, there's absolutely no way that that will continue. And COVID-19 has really proved that, you know, all of the things that we thought were a certainty are kind of no longer there, or they've gone out the window. And so I think that during this period of assessing, you know, where was I going to go next and what was I going to be able to have the most impact in, I really kind of clung to this idea of antifragile. And I think Nassim, he talks about it in a really nice way. And he describes fragility as, you know, if you basically, you know, apply a lot of stress and pressure and uncertainty to something and it breaks, that's something that's fragile. If you apply a lot of stress and pressure and, you know, uncertainty to something and it stays the same, that's resilience. But if you apply a lot of stress, pressure and uncertainty to something and it grows and gets better, that's the anti-fragile. And so when people are always talking about how we need to build, you know, resilient research, we need to build resilient communities, resilient business, I just think everything. You know, we don't actually want things to bounce back. We want them to bounce forwards. So this is all about how we evolve, how we adapt, and how we basically apply a flexible mindset to all that we do. When I was kind of at this point, therefore, of launching into my PhD, and I had, you know, very fortunately, the brilliant advice of my mentor at the time basically said to me, you know, during this time, what's going to be most important is establishing your personal credibility. And that kind of deep credibility, that adaptability and that flexibility is therefore underpinned kind of my research trajectory and my approach to the way that we do academia. At this point, that's when I kind of both delved into the PhD and fortunately partnered up with my sister, who was at a similar time of kind of making a lot of change, to found Social Good Outpost, which is a design and strategy firm that works across Australia and Asia Pacific. I think the kind of outset of that is that we really need a lot of good ideas when it comes to academia. I think that there's a big potential to be entrepreneurial in the way that we do research and kind of build industry partnerships, build kind of engagement that goes beyond universities. And I think that this will be increasingly important as we're all kind of struggling to find, well, where is the right pathway forwards? How can we create, you know, comprehensive research that makes the impact, but also actually exists in a world of uncertainty? Yeah.
So why pursue the academic path in that? Academia is not what it was. You know, it's certainly not the, you know, get your tenured job for life and do the same thing for, you know, 30, 40 years. It's right now we're seeing the extreme fragility of the university sector and so on. And so much of what you do is outside the university sort of realm. So why pursue academia with all the other stuff?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the really important parts of being agile and being impactful in academia. And I suppose if I had have just pursued a path of academia, as I have, you know, I've published, you know, the number of required number of publications, and I've done all of the other extra stuff. It's just that I've tried to add a little bit on top. And I suppose that it's what you add on top that really brings the value to what you do in academia. From my perspective, kind of when we're looking at these sorts of things, I've always tried to look at, well, what will kind of add to each other. So for instance, my research, my PhD in women's leadership in international relations, it required building really extensive relationships and partnerships with kind of the organizations I was working with, in order to be able to effectively, you know, be observational, kind of on ground all across the world to really understand, well, what was the circumstances like? Now, to try and get support to do that as a PhD student would be very, very difficult without actually then also looking at, well, how can we strengthen this? And rather than kind of maybe doing a lot of stuff outside of the PhD, it's rather that I've brought everything in. So the way that I see it is, you know, when I do a lot of my work with social good outpost or across the ASEAN region, I do a lot of keynotes on my research. I embed a lot of the practices of my research into my work. And so for me, it's been this really nice way of balancing the theoretical knowledge and all of this really important stuff, particularly now where we're seeing a decline in the kind of decline in experts, you know. People are kind of pulling down expertise, and I think right now is when we need to have this really high level expert engagement out there with the people and with the communities, because that is the purpose of education, you know, to reach as many people as possible and to bring as many people as possible towards on that journey.
Couldn't agree more. So you've been, as part of one of these sort of other things you've been doing, is running a series of public diplomacy events in ASEAN through the Australia Now program. How did an opportunity like that even come along? It just sounds like the most amazing sort of series of events. And I read somewhere that you'd organised 50 events in a single year. Mind boggles as to how that's even possible. But
Yeah.
how did you get yourself into that in the first place?
At the start of last year, actually, I sat down with my partner and I was looking at the year ahead, and I thought, great, I have nothing on my calendar. I can just sit down and I can just write my PhD.
That's a dangerous thing to do.
And yeah, but
Unfortunately, every time.
That's it. But what ended up happening, actually, I think the whole way along, and I think this is a really good other thing that I'd say is, you know, obviously we're publishing all of the time being in academia, but alongside that, I was trying to write as many kind of approachable, popular media kind of blogs and articles, basically around this idea of what I perceived was missing from Australia's foreign policy at the time, which was, I thought, youth. You know, we don't have a youth strategy for foreign affairs, whereas the US and Canada and lots of other kind of countries are building these sorts of strategies and engagement. And so I'd been writing on these things quietly. I'd been organising events like what I mentioned earlier in Hong Kong, and basically building this, I guess, practical expertise and experience in the region, so that when I got a call from, you know, DFAT one day saying, hey, we're doing this really cool project, the focus is on youth for the first time, you know, would you be interested in running it, part of it? I just launched at the opportunity, and I think that part of it was, you know, luck of being in the right place at the right time. But I'd also say that, you know, luck is built. You know, I took 10 years of building credibility and expertise and positioning myself at the nexus of where I thought were really important areas. I mean, our region has the biggest youth population in the world. If you look at the research and data on, you know, conflict areas, the people that know what's going on the ground, they're young people, you know, they're children, they're the next generation who can move about without being seen. They have a really good understanding of lots of different things. So from my mind, this is a really important kind of space to be part of. And so part of this has been basically working with DFAT in Canberra and the Australian embassies and high commissions across Southeast Asia to create a series of really impactful public diplomacy events that engage international audiences and Australian audiences kind of show the innovative potential of Australia, of which I believe that there is a lot, and basically run a lot of events and engagements around core topics of collaboration in our region. So climate change, gender equality, startup, social enterprise, how do you adapt resiliently to kind of economic disruption? I think we did events on artificial intelligence, technology, sustainable fashion. We even got to do just some super cool events, like hold the first public event that we know of in Laos on LGBTI, or even months after the death penalty in phase 3 Sharia law was introduced into Brunei, going and working with communities in Brunei around LGBTI. I mean, some really, really cool events that I think were at the kind of cutting edge. But also, as you say, it was quite exhausting. So almost 50 events, working with over 3,000 people individually in the 6 months of last year, whilst trying to finish my PhD. Probably I would not recommend to others, but I survived.
Exactly. Do you think, I mean, obviously there would have been, but significant political challenges involved in running these sorts of events, and running events, young people who want to be challenging the status quo, but that status quo has a lot of power and can do a lot of harm as well. So how did you balance that need to allow young people to really challenge people in positions of power and established views and values and things, but in a way that didn't sort of put them at risk?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because, in a lot of the areas that I was working in, I'd rock up to events, for instance, and we'd be warned, go through the side gate. The police have got their cameras on that front gate. They want to know what you're talking about, and we did have to negotiate a few of the topics in that, because we were about empowering a next generation of people, particularly in countries where there may have been more oppressive regimes, or, in Cambodia, for instance, some of the regimes are kind of closing down on what young people can do, and their access is very severely limited in many sectors. But what I did find was that, business and the creative industries were the places where young people would go into and make change. And I just found it so fascinating, when we're thinking about how do we empower any generations of or groups of marginalized or minority people. Often we think, if they're not in politics, or if they're not in that, therefore they're not making change, or they're disengaged, or there's no even potential for us to engage with them, because who are they? What are they doing? But actually, when it came to a lot of these locations, you would just find, okay, if they are experiencing challenges getting into, influencing change in this one sector, they might go into business or creative industries, and social enterprise was actually a really big part of that. People who would go in and they had a social outcome that they wanted to influence or affect, and they had a business as a means to provide the funding and kind of vehicle to make that change. So I think that was a really fascinating part of it. And I think that negotiating uncertain, difficult, unsteady politics is always going to be a part of whatever work we do, particularly in national security, diplomacy, all these kinds of things. But there are immense opportunities. And I think that's one of the beauties of giving opportunities like this to people who are seeing things differently, or have different connections, and can maybe make a different inroad to work with communities.
Yeah, and there's a great next project there.
Yeah.
Next, the academic research project, to look at how young people, use alternative pathways and mechanisms. We've known for a long time that the arts has been a great way of challenging the status quo and doing things that are not necessarily politically acceptable, being able to do that. But really interesting to hear that business is another way of doing that, and social enterprise and so on. There is a fantastic study to be done there. So there you go, postdoc.
Got a list of them now. So.
Look, you just had an article out in the European Journal of Politics and Gender, so congratulations, a formal academic sort of tick in the box, if you like, and it's called Invisible While Visible, an Australian perspective on queer women's leaders in international affairs. great title. I keep talking to people about their titles. Everybody seems to have fantastic titles. I'm going to have to go and start commissioning people to write better ones for me. So I don't have boring ones anymore. But what do you mean by invisible while visible?
Yeah, so if you know anything about women in international affairs or the research on women in international affairs, you'll know that there is not much out there. And in fact, in the history of our international relations, women have frequently been sidelined, totally excluded, or essentially not seen as a useful category for analysis. So if you add then sexuality or you know, looking at LGBTI as another lens to that, you'll find again, there's even less on that. And in fact, that article published with the European Journal of Politics and Gender is one of the first kind of articles that does expose not just, you know, what's it like to be queer, but also a woman in diplomacy. And one of the big things there that I found is, you know, there are actually phenomenal LGBTI diplomats out there. You know, it's traditionally been a space in which was quite welcoming and friendly to LGBTI individuals, particularly given that, you know, often you might be posted to far away places in the world, you know, and sometimes it was easier for people who didn't have families, so, you know, children, which wasn't always possible for LGBTI people. So it was much easier to be posted. But as a consequence of this too, the research basically found that there was LGBTI people face a deep exclusion within international affairs. And, you know, I had story after story of women who might have their partner there on post, but hadn't been able to be out or kind of public in the whole 3 or 4 years that they'd been there. So they basically had to keep that quiet. And if you've tried ever doing that for one day, trying not to reveal the gender of your partner in conversations, I urge you to try it one time. It's very, very difficult. So essentially, you know, this concept of queer women being in these really highly visible roles, often under immense scrutiny, you know, very important, high stakes, all of these kinds of things, and yet still not being fully seen, not being able to be fully seen, and that being kind of a really big part of their experiences. The other thing I would say that was really interesting from the research was that even the heterosexual women that I interviewed kind of found that they were frequently typified as if they were gay, which to me was this kind of, I don't know, emblematic of othering, that maybe women, you know, if they had short hair, if they were single at post, if they were just a senior person in leadership, they must be gay. And so I also thought that was quite interesting as a bit of a finding there.
I thought that was really interesting reading the article. I hadn't sort of expected to sort of read that. But you said at the same time, you've got this idea that women who are not queer were often typified as it, but that diplomatic privilege to some extent protected women who actually are queer. So you've got this very strange tension there.
It's a very, it's such a unique world. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, there are still 70 countries in the world who criminalize homosexuality, I think 40 of which have a death penalty. When we're looking at those sort of statistics, and when we're looking at the research, there's not necessarily any place that is safe. For instance, even the United States 2 years ago, basically stopped issuing partner visas to LGBTI people unless they were married, which of course has all kinds of implications. But generally speaking, you know, diplomacy does allow people of very diverse backgrounds and ethnicities to work in really contentious locations. I mean, imagine getting diplomatic privilege or immunity or, you know, the protections of your whole country. And so I think that there's kind of this really interesting dynamic there. And actually one of the findings that I talk about is, you know, in my research, in some cases, queer women were kind of the best capable of fulfilling the roles of the diplomat, given that diplomacy still relies on, you know, a dual role of a diplomat plus their spouse in order for the whole thing to function and work. And what I found was that women that went over with their husbands or with a male partner, often that male partner wouldn't be as likely to take up the unpaid labor of diplomacy, which is fair enough. whereas women were more likely to do that, or maybe more used to it. And so you'd see kind of two women households who were actually extremely efficient and kind of were able to take on quite a lot there. So there was a lot of interesting nuances in the research.
So this idea that, you know, female diplomats kind of need a wife.
Oh, for sure.
We don't want to say that.
The number of times,
that's really a really problematic thing, but
right.
It might actually be, you know, what seems to work best.
That's right. And one of my it was mentioned many times, but one of my interviewees said, you know, the most successful women in the department are women with wives. And I mean, that's quite interesting in itself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So look, we're just about out of time. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask Elise, please post them on the chat. I have an obvious question to finish up from me, and that's what's next? What's the plan? Insofar as there can be one in this sort of uncertain time.
Yes, well, it is something, but I think I'm really excited about this next phase. And, you know, as we talked earlier about this notion of anti-fragility, fortunately, in a way, I feel like I've been in training for the last 5 years of exactly this moment. And so for me, you know, research, I absolutely love it. I think there's just so much value going forwards. And so I'm definitely keen to pursue postdoctoral research. And I'm currently looking at a few different things in there, from kind of the research that you mentioned before, looking at space, women in space, a few other kind of frontier elements of international relations. But I'm also very keen. I've got a few diplomatic programs that'll be running for the next 2 years. So we're carrying on working with Malaysia for 2020 and 2021 on public diplomacy events. And I'm very excited to just continue working in this space of, you know, gender equality strategy, ASEAN engagement, and moving forwards really, really big community change, I think.
Wow. Well, that all sounds brilliant, and we can't wait to see what you do next. So thanks for joining us today, and for a really, really fascinating conversation, and just yet another sort of these Asia stories that really highlight how you can really carve out a very unique individual pathway in this sort of, you know, academic life. I don't think anyone's story has been even remotely similar so far in the series. People have, you know, found ways to do their work and have an impact in the world in all sorts of really, really interesting sort of ways. So yeah, thanks very, very much for that, and wish you all the best with whatever comes up next. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Dara Shah about Indian women migrant workers and about female entrepreneurs. So I hope you can join me at the same time next week for that. The recording of this, of course, will be available in the next few days, and we'll post the link for that on Twitter. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining me. We'll see you again next week. Bye.